There is a specific grief that has no publicly acceptable name, not the grief of death, which comes with rituals and casseroles and the understood, permission to fall apart in front of other people, not the grief of divorce or job, loss, or the other categorized heartbreaks that society has developed, a language for, a protocol, a series of expected stages with a recovery arc built in. This grief is quieter than all of those, and in some ways more corrosive, because it arrives not from losing something you had, but from finally understanding, with adult clarity and no remaining room for the comfortable interpretations of childhood, that something you believed you had was never quite real. The grief of understanding that your parents chose someone else, not in the abstract, not in the small daily ways that families make and unmake priorities, but deliberately, formally, in a document prepared by an attorney and signed in the presence of witnesses, with the full weight of legal intention behind it. The grief of learning that the love you had always quietly questioned was, in at least one significant and measurable sense, exactly as conditional as you feared. I am telling you this at the beginning because I want you to understand what I was carrying before. I tell you what I received. The ending of this story is not the point. The ending is only meaningful in proportion to the weight of everything that preceded it. And the weight was considerable. And I need you to feel it before I ask you to put it down with me. Let me take you back to where this begins, which is not with the will. The will was just the place where everything that had already been true became impossible to reframe as something else. My family had 3 children. I was the middle one, a position that carries its own mythology. The forgotten child, the one without the privileges of firsthood or the indulgences of being the baby. And while I have always been somewhat skeptical of birth order determinism, I will tell you that in our particular family, the mythology turned out to be more accurate than I would have chosen. My older brother Joel was the responsible one, the one my parents pointed to when they wanted to demonstrate that they had done something right. My younger sister Vanessa was the one they pointed to when they wanted to demonstrate something else entirely, something closer to reflected glory, to the particular satisfaction of a parent whose child has exceeded not just expectation but category. Vanessa was wealthy, not comfortable, not successful, not doing well, wealthy in the way that requires a different vocabulary. The way that means private, planes and properties in multiple time zones, and a last name that, because of her marriage to a man whose family had been building things for 4 generations, now opened doors that our family's original last name had never been near. She had married into this at 28 and had inhabited it with a naturalness that suggested she had always belonged there, which was either a sign of her adaptability or a sign that she had always known she was going to end up somewhere like this and had simply been patient. My parents were dazzled by her. I want to be fair about this. I think most parents would have been. Vanessa's life was extraordinary by conventional measures. And my parents were conventional people who measured things conventionally. And the gap between the life they had imagined for their children and the life Vanessa had actually built was so enormous and so glittering that I think it genuinely reorganized something in them. It rearranged their internal map of who mattered and what mattered and who deserved what, in the way that proximity to great wealth sometimes rearranges people who have spent their lives at a careful distance from it. I was a teacher, middle school history, the grade that everyone agrees is the most difficult and that nobody who hasn't done it can fully understand. The grade where children are simultaneously the most vulnerable and the most armored, where the work of actual education is threaded through the constant, exhausting work of simply keeping 11 and 12-year-olds emotionally regulated, enough to learn anything at all. I was good at it. I knew I was good at it in the way that you know when something fits, when the shape of a thing matches some corresponding shape inside you. My students' test scores were consistently strong, but more than that, more than any metric I could have pointed to, there was something happening in my classroom that I recognized as real. Kids who had been told they weren't academic, discovering that history was actually a story, and that stories were something they could inhabit and argue about and care about. That was the work. That was what I showed up for. My parents respected it in the abstract, the way people respect something they don't fully value. They said the right things at the right moments. They attended things when attendance was required. But I was aware, I had been aware for years, with the increasing clarity of an adult who has stopped editing his own perceptions out of kindness to people who don't particularly deserve it. That teacher, in their framework, was a placeholder, a reasonable choice for someone who hadn't managed to do something more impressive. A fine life, a good life, just not a life that recalibrated anything. Vanessa's life recalibrated everything. By the time I was 36, the architecture of my family's favoritism had become so settled and so unexamined that it operated almost below the level of intention. It wasn't that my parents sat down and decided to value Vanessa more than me. I don't think it was ever that conscious. It was more that Vanessa's world had become the world they oriented toward, the star they navigated by, and in the gravitational pull of that orientation, Joel and I had simply been left in progressively darker space. Joel managed it by not engaging. He had a wife and 3 children and a life in another city, and he had made a private peace with our parents that involved visiting twice a year and keeping conversations at a surface level and never pulling any threads. I managed it differently, which is to say I managed it badly, which is to say I kept showing up with my actual self and expecting something that kept not being there and being freshly wounded each time, which is the definition of a pattern I should have interrupted sooner than I did. The holidays were the worst. Vanessa's visits were events, preparations made, menus adjusted, the guest room transformed. My parents visibly brightened and enlarged by her presence in a way they never were by mine. She would arrive with gifts that were expensive and impeccably chosen, and my parents would hold them with the careful reverence people reserve for things they feel honored to receive. I would arrive with things I had made or found or chosen with genuine attention, and they would be received warmly and set aside. I am not telling you this to make myself sound pathetic. I am telling you this because the accumulation of these moments over decades is what created the context in which what happened next was possible. You don't change a will in your child's disfavor over a single incident. You do it after years of a quietly reconfigured sense of who your children are and what they deserve. And that reconfiguration happens in the small moments, the holiday moments, the moments where one child makes you feel important and reflected and proud, and another child simply loves you without making you feel like anything in particular. And you mistake the one that makes you feel good for the one that matters most. I found out about the will the way I found out about most significant family information, not directly, not from my parents but sideways, through a conversation that was never meant to reach me. Joel called me on a Thursday evening. He had heard from a cousin, who had heard from an aunt who had been present at a family dinner where my parents had apparently discussed their estate plans with a casualness that suggested they had not considered who might eventually relay the information that my parents had updated their will, that the primary beneficiary of their estate, which was not vast but was meaningful, the house they'd owned for 30 years, and the savings they'd accumulated with considerable discipline, was Vanessa. Not divided 3 ways, not adjusted proportionally, Vanessa. Joel told me this in the careful, apologetic tone of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have. I listened. I asked a few clarifying questions. I thanked him. I got off the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time in the specific stillness that descends when something you half knew becomes something you fully know, and there is no longer any available distance between you and it. I did not call my parents that night or the next night. I spent 2 weeks deciding what to do with what I knew, which really meant spending 2 weeks deciding who I was going to be in response to it. Whether I was going to be the person who confronted, the person who withdrew, the person who pretended not to know, or the person who simply continued, steady and clear-eyed, doing the work of being who he was, regardless of whether anyone in his immediate family was paying appropriate attention. I chose to continue, not out of passivity. I want to be precise about this because the distinction matters, not because I was unable to confront them or afraid of what a confrontation would cost, but because I had spent 36 years trying to change my parents' perception of me through argument, through achievement, through presence, and none of it had moved the needle in any durable way. And I had finally arrived at the understanding that I was not going to think my way or argue my way or love my way into a version of my parents that was capable of seeing me the way I needed to be seen. That version did not exist, and the energy I had been spending trying to produce it was energy I needed for the life I was actually living. I told my therapist. I told my closest friend, a woman named Priya who had known me since graduate school, and who responded with the precise balance of outrage and clarity that I needed. And I told my grandfather. My grandfather's name was August. He was my mother's father, 79 years old, still sharp, still living alone in the house he had shared with my grandmother until her death, 6 years prior, still reading actual physical newspapers, and doing the crossword in pen and growing tomatoes in the summer with the same focused attention he brought to everything. August was the person in my family who had always seen me most clearly, and I had always known this, and I had always been quietly grateful for it, without fully understanding how significant it was until I was sitting in his kitchen one Saturday afternoon and telling him what I had learned about the will and watching his face as he listened. He did not say much during the telling. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without preparing his response while you were still talking, which is rarer than it should be, and which I had always found more comforting than almost any response he could have given. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup, and then he looked up at me and said, "Your mother has always been better at being impressed than at being grateful. I love her, but that's true." It was the most honest thing anyone in my family had ever said to me about my family. He asked me how I was, not how I was handling it, not what I was going to do about it, how I was. I told him the truth, which was that I was sad in a way that felt very old. Like, I was sad about something that had been true for a long time and was only now being acknowledged. Formally. He nodded. He said, "That's an honest answer." And then he refilled my coffee and we talked about other things for 2 hours, and I drove home feeling, inexplicably, better than I had in weeks. August died 14 months later, peacefully in his house, which was what he had always wanted. The tomatoes were already in the ground for the season, and the crossword from that morning was on the kitchen table, half finished, which I found out later, and which struck me as such a perfectly August way to leave, mid-thought, mid-engagement, interested in the world right up until the moment he wasn't. I grieved him in the enormous, unperformed way that I grieve things that actually matter. My mother grieved him too. In her way, she was his daughter, and she had loved him, whatever else was true. The family gathered. The arrangements were made. And 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a call from an attorney who asked me to come to his office for the reading of August's estate. My mother was there. Vanessa was there, having flown in, which told me something about what she expected. Joel was there, and a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be August's longtime neighbor and friend, present because he had left her his tomato seeds in his crossword collection and a letter the attorney read aloud that made her cry, quietly and beautifully, for the entire reading. The estate was not what any of us had expected. August had been, it turned out, considerably more disciplined about money over considerably more decades than any of us had known. He had not lived extravagantly. The house, the newspaper, the tomatoes, the coffee, and the gap between what he spent and what he earned over 50 years of careful work had accumulated, quietly and without announcement, into something substantial. My mother received the house which she had expected. Joel received a specific and meaningful bequest that I will not detail, because it was private and was clearly chosen for him specifically, which told me August had thought about each of us individually and carefully. The neighbor received her seeds and her letters, and I received the remainder of the estate. Not divided, not proportional. The remainder, the financial remainder, the investment accounts, the savings, the accumulated, careful discipline of a man who had spent 50 years building something in the quiet spaces of an ordinary life came to me. There was a letter. The attorney read it in the room, and I will not reproduce it here because it belongs to me, but I will tell you what it said in its essential truth, which was this: that August had watched me for 36 years, that he had watched me teach, had listened to me talk about my students with the particular aliveness that people have when they are doing the thing they were built for, that he had watched my family's favoritism with a clarity he had not always known how to address and a regret that he had not addressed it sooner and louder that he believed the things I was doing with my life were more important than anyone had given me credit for, and that he wanted me to have resources that matched that importance, because resources and importance had been distributed incorrectly in our family for too long, and he was in a position to correct at least part of that. And he had decided he would. He used the phrase, "You kept showing up as yourself, even when yourself was not what anyone was asking for. That is rarer than money and harder to build than anything I could leave you. But I'm leaving you this too because you deserve both." My mother's face during the reading was something I did not fully look at in the moment, because I could not afford to be inside her reaction while I was still processing my own. What I caught in my peripheral vision was enough, a series of expressions moving through her too quickly to name, though shock and something that might have been shame were among them. Vanessa was very still. Vanessa was the kind of person who had enough social intelligence to understand in real time what was happening and what it meant, and her stillness was the stillness of someone absorbing a correction they had not anticipated from a direction they had not been watching. Nobody said anything unkind in that room. We were, all of us, operating under the weight of August's presence, which lingered in the room the way the presence of genuinely good people lingers after they leave, as a kind of standard, a reminder of what it looks like to see people clearly and treat them accordingly. Nobody wanted to be the person who behaved badly in the immediate aftermath of August's final statement about who he had seen and who he had valued. My mother called me 3 days later. I want to be honest about what that call was, because I have had to resist the narrative gravity that wants to make it a complete redemption, a full reckoning, a sweeping apology that resolved everything. It was not that. It was a woman of 64 who had been shown something about herself by her father's final act and who was in the early, disorienting stages of processing what that meant. She said, "Daddy always saw something in you that I didn't always stop to look for. I think I understood why today. It was not everything. It was not an apology in any formal sense, but it was honest, and honesty from my mother about this particular subject was so unprecedented that I received it with both hands and held it carefully. I am still teaching. This is the part I most want you to know, not because I had to. August's gift changed what was possible for me materially in significant ways, but because it was never about having to. It was about the thing itself, the shape of the work, the specific aliveness of a classroom where something real is happening. I teach because it is what I was built for, and I know that with the certainty that August saw in me long before, I was sure of it myself. What the resources give me is freedom within the work, a classroom library. I funded entirely myself, a summer program for struggling readers I run at no charge, the ability to stay in a profession I love without the financial attrition that drives so many teachers out of it. August knew. That is what I carry. In all those Saturday afternoon kitchen conversations, all those cups of coffee, all those hours of being listened to by someone who never once checked his phone while I was talking, he was seeing me, building a picture, deciding, in the quiet and deliberate way he decided everything, what he wanted to do about what he saw. I tend his tomato variety now. I plant them every spring from seeds I saved from his last season, and they come up the same, stubborn, late, worth waiting for. I eat them in August, which is both his name and the month he loved most. And I think about what it means to be witnessed. Not by everyone, not by the people whose witness you spent years trying to earn, but by one person, the right person, who looked long enough and carefully enough to see what was actually there. Here's what I need to give you before I let you go. The people who underestimate you are not the final word on your value. They are not the authority. They are people who are looking at something else, at glitter, at reflected light, at the impressive surfaces of other lives, and mistaking the brightness of those surfaces for the presence of depth. The depth is yours. It has always been yours. And there are people in your life, perhaps quieter than you'd expect, perhaps less central than you'd hope, who have been watching you carry it all this time and who see it with perfect clarity. Find those people. Stay near them. Let them know you in the way that August knew me, fully, practically over coffee and crosswords and conversations that don't need to be significant to be real. Because the witness that counts is not always the loudest one in the room. Sometimes it is the one sitting in the kitchen, pen in hand, half-finished puzzle on the table, watching you with the patient and complete attention of someone who decided a long time ago that you were worth seeing. If you have ever been the one who was overlooked in favor of someone shinier, if you know the weight of being present in a family and invisible to it, leave one word in the comments right now. August. Just that. Because it means something now. And you'll know exactly what. Subscribe, because this is a community built for the ones who kept showing up as themselves even when no one was asking for it. Turn on notifications, because the next story is already written, and it is going to find the exact place in you that needed finding. I'll see you there.